Samantha wakes up in the hospital to face a decision that could change her life forever to become a wolf. Meanwhile, Samuel's future as alpha hangs in the balance. As the two chiefs arrive, what key information can Samantha provide to influence their decision? How will the fates of Samuel and Samantha unfold? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 63. To the death. The fight erupted without a moment's notice. Samuel and Bray were at each other's throats faster than they could even shift. They met midair in a tangle of arms and shifting limbs. As their wolves took control, blood spread and the crowd thinned. Some women screamed. Some men ran for the comfort of the forest. Others stayed in the clearing but backed away just enough so they could watch the challenge unfold. At the head of those who stayed was Goldie. She spread her arms and pushed back those who remained behind, keeping them away from the snarling and out-of-control wolves. Her face was set in a firm grimace, as though she expected disaster. My heart reached and battled with Samuel. Bray had a ferocity that was hard to be matched. With every wound Samuel inflicted, Bray would cause another. With every howl of pain Bray would cry. He'd make sure Samuel felt it tenfold. But Samuel was not a quitter. And he wasn't going to be beaten. The wolves circled each other, lunging and withdrawing. Bray had Samuel backed up against the forest. Both of their fur was standing on edge, rippling with anticipation. Blood stained Samuel's coat to the point that the blonde was nearly invisible. He was limping heavily on one leg and a chunk of his ear was missing. Bray was none the worse. He tried to hide it but his back leg was nearly gone. The battle raged and raged. Minutes passed by quicker than seconds. With each one the wolves became more wounded. But this didn't slow them down. They tumbled over one another, tore with teeth, pounced with vigor. This was the end of the line for them both, and neither was content to let the fight end quickly. Bray lunged. As soon as he did, he realized his mistake. Samuel whirled, dodging as he dove to the side and leaped off a tree, then rounded to pounce on Peyton's back. He tore into his neck and Bray's black wolf crumbled. The struggle continued for a few minutes more as Peyton tried everything to get Samuel off his back. But Samuel was relentless. His wolf was beyond anything I'd ever seen. At that moment I think Samuel could have taken over the world. When Peyton ceased his struggles, Samuel shifted back to his skin. He still held Bray pinned to the ground and soon enough he shifted back as well. The clearing was in absolute silence and the only thing to break it was the sound of the men's heavy breathing. "Submit," Samuel commanded, digging his elbow into Bray's neck. "You'll never be fit," Peyton panted. He gasped for air as Samuel dug deeper into his airway. "You're not even a real wolf," Samuel roared. He drew back a fist and sent it flying at Peyton. Blood splattered and blended with grass and skin. "They won't accept you," Bray shouted. "I've already told the chiefs. You'll never be alpha. Nobody wants you. It's over, Bray. You've lost," Samuel shouted. Their faces were inches apart. "Submit." There was a pause stiller than silence. Then Bray laughed. "To the death, Samuel." Without warning, he shifted back to his wolf and lunged. His teeth went for Samuel's torso, but before they could end his life, Samuel turned and grabbed the wolf's neck. He jumped on Bray's back, twisted, and fell. The echo of a sickening crack went on for what felt like hours. Samuel laid motionless on Bray's wolf's back. Bray was no longer breathing. Samuel looked lifeless as well. No one else dared to move. The first to break this trance was Goldie. She rushed forward and knelt by Samuel and began running her hands along his back. They came back coated in blood. My eyes narrowed and I realized that though the fight was over, Samuel was far from all right. Blood was continuously pouring from countless wounds across his body. Goldie wasted no time in grabbing pieces of shredded clothing and covering the gashes. "Marshall," she cried, searching the clearing. My gaze whipped down to him. His hands were flying across Will's body, but he kept glancing at Samuel. With the little amount of strength I had left, I pushed him off of Will. "Samuel needs you." My voice broke. I couldn't tear my gaze from Samuel. I tried moving toward him but my legs refused to work. They didn't respond to my commands. I knew I was pinned beneath Will, and for the time being I blamed my inability to move on that. With another desperate lurching of my heart, I pushed at Marshall as tears spilled from my eyes. "Go to Samuel, please. We'll be all right." "Samuel." Marshall looked at me for half a second before he sprang up and sprinted across the clearing. He and Goldie acted together, barking orders at those who remained to watch the fight. Black spots danced in my vision as I watched them work. I tried to keep my attention on Will. I could see the unsteady rise and fall of his chest, which meant he was alive. He was unconscious and his head was still in my lap, preventing me from moving. Not that I wanted to. Now that I had nothing to distract me, my own pain was growing. With every passing moment, another part of my body exploded in agony. My mind was screaming at me to stay awake, to focus on Will and Samuel, but my body wouldn't cooperate. A small part of my mind begged for sleep and reminded me that Will and Samuel were in good hands. Marshall had tended to Will, and now he and Goldie were going to fix Samuel. They didn't need me. They would be okay. But then I would catch sight of the bloody rags being piled onto Samuel's body. Without my permission, my heart would stutter and send a wave of anxiety through my veins. My mind and body were at war and I wasn't sure who was winning. My vision was letting in more darkness than light. My eyes were fluttering. I thought I heard someone calling my name. My mind responded, but my mouth didn't. When my world finally went dark, I was still fighting against the reprieve of rest. My consciousness shifted to nightmares of dead bodies and bloody figures. Though my body slept, it was far from resting. I knew I woke up several times, but each time I did was more confusing than the last. Sometimes there was light. Sometimes there were voices. After a while, I didn't know what was real and what wasn't. After a while, I didn't care. Then I heard his voice. It started off as a distant hum in the back corners of my mind, and grew as a torrential wave threatening to break the shore. I held on to it like a drunken sailor searching for land, and eventually I found the light. When I awoke, it was to more darkness. But this kind was different than before. There was a soft glow from beside me and an ache in my chest. In fact, there was an ache all over my body. I groaned and tried to sit up, my eyes adjusting to my new world. I was in a bed with wires all over my body. They strangled my hands as I pulled at them, dazed and confused. A monitor beeped behind me. Something stirred beside my bed. I turned and found the all too familiar sight of Samuel, sitting in a hospital chair pulled too close for comfort. He was leaning on my bed and cradling my hand in his own. His head was bowed and resting on folded arms. His shoulders rose and fell in a steady and comforting rhythm. That rhythm broke as I involuntarily groaned, pain shooting up my legs and into my chest. I sucked in a deep breath and tried to remain quiet, but Samuel was already waking up. He lifted his head as if it held the weight of the world. His eyes blinked several times as he searched the room. Finally, his gaze landed on me. He went still. His gaze darted across my eyes, down my body to the machines behind me, and finally back to my eyes. His mouth was left hanging open as he struggled to speak. I laughed once, and the spell of stillness was broken. Samuel jumped from his chair and grabbed my hands, holding them tight within his own. He dipped his head into my shoulder and stayed there, shoulder shaking. "Samantha." His whispered words sent chills across my skin. "You're really awake." I nodded my head and held Samuel on my shoulder. The world was flooding back to me. The last time I saw him, he was covered in blood and barely alive. To see him beside me was more than a miracle. I brought both my hands to cradle his head, pulling it away from my shoulder. I stared at him, evaluating his face as much as I could in the dimmed light. He seemed tired, worn down, and there were scabs littering his skin. But he was alive and he was here. I shook my head, a smile creeping onto my face. "Samuel." He laughed once. "At your service." My voice cracked, barely a whisper. "How are you, okay? It's nice to know you have so much faith in me." We both laughed and I dropped his face. He sat back down in his chair, pulling it closer to my bed and not letting go of my hands. He turned to the side and brought me a glass of water, which I gulped down. When he turned back, I caught sight of the side of his face. The light illuminated it just right so that I could see the chunk of skin missing from the side of his head where his ear used to be. My eyes widened. "Samuel, your ear, I know." He smiled. I grabbed his head and turned it to the side so I could examine the two folds of skin where his ear used to be. I ran my fingers over the surrounding skin, but he groaned and took my hands gently away, shaking his head. "Still a bit sore, Samantha." I dropped my hands, horrified. I'm okay. He cut me off. Then, his gaze flickered to my neck and down my body. Are you? How are you feeling? I'm fine, I automatically answered. In truth, I was in a hell of a lot of pain. My body felt hot, uncomfortable, and heavy. But I didn't want pain medicine to put me to sleep again. How long was I out? Only a day or so. How are you okay? Samuel cocked his head and smirked. I'm a fast healer, remember? Right. I laughed once. The motion sent a wave of pain through me. I tried not to wince but couldn't keep it from leaking onto my face. Samuel's brow furrowed. Before he could say anything about it, I broke in. What did I miss? How is Will? What happened? He gave me a look, then dropped his gaze and sighed. Will is recovering all right. Marshall was able to help him a lot in the clearing, so there won't be any lasting damage. A weight was lifted off my chest. Thank goodness. Samuel kept his gaze down. There's something else you should know. What is it? Is it with the pack? What happened after Bray? He rubbed his neck and gazed at me for a moment. That's been put on hold until you woke up. The chiefs are here though. They saw everything. What? How? They came early, he sighed. Heard everything in the clearing and watched it happen. Wait. I brought my fingers to my temples, massaging a headache. I think I remember seeing wolves. Before you got there. Samuel didn't look surprised. They saw almost everything. Well then what's the problem? Why do they need me? They need statements and things. Well, do you know what's going to happen? He sighed and took a long pause. No. Not after Bray announced I was human. Just like that, the weight fell back on my heart. I struggled to speak for a moment. Samuel, you don't have to say it. Sorry. I'm so sorry. You trusted me and I told Raven and she told Bray, and it's just made everything more complicated for you, and I'm so sorry, and I never meant for any of this to happen, and now. Samuel silenced me with a hand on my lips. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's okay, Samantha. You didn't know this would happen. I lowered his hand and held it in my own. But I should have. Tears pricked at my eyes. He tilted his head and wiped the side of my eye with his other hand. Don't tell yourself that. You can't change what happened. You trusted Raven. We all did. I'm not upset and neither should you be. I took a shaky breath. But I am. It makes sense though, you know. What? How we left your apartment so easily that night. How she never got hurt. I shook my head, stealing a glance at Samuel. I should have seen it coming. I trusted her too. He squeezed my hand. Images from the other night flew through my mind. Is she all right? Samuel let out a short breath. I don't know. No one can find her. She's gone. Samuel nodded. It's probably for the best. I took a breath and traced one of Samuel's knuckles. I thought maybe Will killed her. We would have found her body. Somehow that didn't make me feel any better. We sat in silence for a few moments, the beeping of monitors keeping time. Eventually I sighed and tried lifting myself up. When pain shot down my legs, I winced and cast a sheepish look at Samuel. His eyebrows were scrunched together and his mouth was set in a thin line. You shouldn't be moving, he said. I know. I guess, can you just help me to the bathroom? For some reason, Samuel's eyes went wide. His mouth was left hanging open as his gaze darted from me to the bathroom door. After a moment I laughed, if only to ease the awkward silence. It's all right if you don't want to. I can just ask a nurse. No. He refused to look at me. Okay. I drew out the word. What do you expect me to do then? Samuel rubbed the back of his neck, shooting me hesitant glances every few seconds. He opened and closed his mouth several times. His knee bounced and even I was beginning to feel his apprehension. Samuel, there's something you should know. When he was silent again, I scoffed. Well, are you going to tell me? He looked down my body, his gaze slowly traveling back up to my face. Marshall and other doctors worked really hard on you. James and Bray did a lot of damage. It was James, I said breathlessly. He's dead, right? Right. Samuel nodded once. He took another breath, then gathered my hands in both of his. Samantha, there was a lot of damage. What are you saying? What happened? He looked as if he wanted to look away, but he held my gaze. His eyes shone and his grip was firm. After a moment he took a large breath and finally told me. They had to amputate your leg. There was a beat. What? The injuries were too much for your body to heal. It was all already infected. I let out a nervous laugh. No, you're wrong. I can still feel pain down there. Samuel glanced down, closing his eyes. It's gone, Samantha. Tears welled up in my eyes. I ripped my hands from him, sitting up and tearing at the sheets that covered my body. Samuel stood and tried to calm me, but the damage was done. The sheets were gone from my bed and I was staring at the empty space where my leg used to be. Chapter 64. Not fine. Nothing made sense. My world was suspended for what felt like an eternity. I could still feel the pain. But when I looked down, nothing was there. I was missing a piece of me. Piece that still hurt. Tears poured from my eyes. My body shook with sobs. I was numb to anything else but the sight of the stump that used to be my leg. It broke off just below the knee and was wrapped in layers upon layers of gauze. It didn't look like my body, my leg. It made more sense that it belonged to someone else and this was just another nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. In the nightmares, I was always alone. Now I had someone beside me, holding me up when I couldn't do it for myself. Samuel clung to me, and I to him. We were two broken beings trying to keep the other from falling apart. Eventually I fell asleep. Samuel crawled into the bed next to me, even though he was half hanging off the small mattress. He gathered me in his arms and dried my tears, soothing my sobs and pushing away the nightmare that was now a reality. When I awoke, he hadn't moved. I rubbed my eyes and buried my face into his arm for countless minutes. Sunlight was streaming through the window though, lighting up the room and introducing a new day. The rays peeking through the window hit Samuel directly in the eye. The longer this went on, the more he stirred and his breathing became uneven. After a while he took a deep breath and paused, and I knew he was awake. But he didn't say anything. I didn't speak to him either. We only listened to the humming outside the hospital room door, and the light footfall of countless feet passing by. The silence was almost peaceful. There wasn't much that could be said. There wasn't anything I wanted to discuss, and I had a feeling Samuel felt the same way. But despite our preference for a respite in a silent room, the world outside continued to spin. The sunlight left Samuel's face, and when it did, he cleared his throat and spoke. I should get the doctor. They'll want to know you're awake. I nodded. Samuel hesitated, then kissed the top of my head before departing. When I had the room to myself, I flipped onto my back and stared at the ceiling. My heart was at war with all my emotions, but I was too tired to fight. All I knew was that Samuel was there to hold me as I fell apart. For now, that was good enough. I didn't care about mates, I didn't care about wolves, and I didn't care about what was waiting for me beyond these hospital doors. Samuel was here, and that was enough until I was ready to face the world. Maybe then I wouldn't have to do it alone. Samuel returned a few moments later. At his side were Marshall and Dr. Gates. Marshall smiled while Dr. Gates looked over her clipboard. We're glad to see you awake, Samantha, Marshall said. Nice to see that Sammy boy hasn't finished you off yet. Samuel shot Marshall a glare as an uncomfortable laugh escaped me. Dear. Gates ignored them both and came to my side, inspecting the machines beside my bed. How is your pain? She asked. It's fine. It's not fine. Samuel stepped forward. Dear. Gates nodded and continued her work with the machines. Marshall came up behind her, stopping at the foot of my bed. He placed his hands on the bed frame and looked at me with crinkling eyes. Will is getting along great, he said. He's awake and recovering. You can see him when we're finished with you. I nodded and smiled. Samuel came up to stand beside me and Marshall gazed at us with a look of adoration. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but he shook his head and watched Dr. Gates instead. After a moment, she withdrew from the machines. Everything is looking well, Samantha. When you're ready, we can discuss further treatment for your leg. Or lack thereof, Marshall quipped. Marshall. Samuel shot him a look of absolute fury. Something pricked my heart, and for a moment I was tempted to do something other than frown. Marshall watched me as my face fought different expressions before he mumbled under his breath and looked at Samuel with a glint in his eyes. Dr. Gates ignored us all and walked around my bed. She hung the clipboard at the base and said, We'll leave you to your morning. I'm glad you're doing better, Samantha. She began to walk out of the room and Marshall followed suit. He shot me a glance as they left, winking as Samuel lowered himself in the seat next to me. I'm sorry about him, Samuel said as soon as the door was shut. Don't worry about it. He sighed. I know you want to see Will, but the chiefs want to talk to you before you see anyone else. I nodded. I should have figured as much. You don't have to see them right away. Instead of responding, I looked at Samuel. He was staring at my sheets. Underneath his eyes were dark circles and his hair was beyond repair. The side of his head, where there used to be an ear, was now covered with red and inflamed skin. He wore a long-sleeve shirt, and I was beginning to think it was supposed to cover the rest of his injuries. How long has it been since a doctor looked at you? Samuel looked up, confused. I don't know. I'm good. No, you're not. Get Marshall back in here. He groaned. Anyone but him. I set my mouth in a firm line. Samuel squinted his eyes and looked at me, twisting his lips into a frown. If I do this, then you have to tell me when you're not feeling okay. No exceptions. You feel pain, you tell me, or a doctor and we'll take care of it. Then you have to tell me the same thing and let Marshall look at you. Samuel groaned. How about we just agree to tell each other these things and forget Marshall? Absolutely not. Samuel grumbled something and pulled out his phone. He typed away, hopefully texting Marshall, then put it on the desk beside us. Silence stretched for a moment, but I could tell Samuel was uncomfortable. What is it? He looked up. I'm just thinking about you. My voice quieted. About my leg. He nodded. And other things. What are you thinking? I shrugged. Same. And you? A ghost of a smile appeared on his lips. If I'd have known this was all it took to get you to think about me, I would have done it ages ago. I grimaced, but Samuel laughed. Bad joke. Horrible. He laughed again, then grew sober. How are you doing today, though? I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice from shaking. My initial reaction was to slough off his concern, but at that point, I knew Samuel would never believe me. That, and realized I didn't want to pretend anymore. I'm not fine. Samuel reached for my hands and buried his face within our fingers. That's okay. You. He let out a heavy breath. I'm not fine either. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. I wish I could say I had earth-shattering epiphanies in that time, but my brain was numbed. Everything I ever knew was gone or changed, including pieces of myself. The very person I wanted to stay away from was now the one person I needed and wanted. I was too broken to care about what I once dreamed of. Those dreams were gone and there was no getting them back. I didn't know what the future held, and for once I didn't want to dream about it. For once the present was enough. It's kind of fitting I suddenly broke the long silence. In a sick and twisted way. Samuel sat up and looked at me. Care to elaborate? We're both missing pieces of ourselves, and that only happened because we're supposedly supposed to complete each other. He glanced down. That's kind of a morbid way of putting it. Maybe. Samuel paused, then looked back up. Do you think we complete each other? My brow furrowed and I continued staring at the ceiling. I don't really know what to think. I know that since I met you both our lives have gone to hell. I know. None of this would have happened if I didn't find you. I shook my head once, then turned to look at Samuel. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know what would have happened. What did happen is horrible and there's a lot that I wish I could change. But I can't change anything and neither can you. So now we're both left in the aftermath of it all with nothing but each other. Samuel refused to look at me. He was staring holes in my sheets and his shoulders were stiff. I grabbed his hand that was resting next to me and squeezed, willing him to look up. When he didn't, I grabbed his chin and directed his gaze back to me. We're both left in a horrible mess of things with nothing but each other to keep us sane. But I don't think that's such a bad thing. He was quiet for a moment, searching my eyes. Then he told me in a soft voice, I don't think so either. What might have been a smile framed my next words. You're not such horrible company, you know? I glanced to the mangled flesh where his ear once was and felt a pang shoot through my heart. I tried to keep my voice light, but I wasn't sure I actually managed it. You might need me now anyway. I doubt you'll be able to hear. And I might need you. I won't be able to walk, and I don't think a three-legged wolf is set up for success. Samuel stiffened and bowed his head, gripping his neck. It shouldn't have happened. You were bitten and it wasn't your choice. I know. It was more than just your leg. It shouldn't have happened. I know. I ran my hand along my neck and shoulder before stopping short. There was only minimal bandaging, if you could even call it that. The place I knew James had bitten me was a minor inconvenience compared to how the rest of my body felt. This only added to my fears. When Samuel remained silent, I shook my head and looked to the ceiling. By now, I practically had all the ceiling tiles memorized, each bump, each crevice, each discoloration. They were the only things keeping me sane in moments like this. Finally, I closed my eyes and whispered the thing I'd known since I'd woken up. I'm going to change. To shift. Samuel closed both of his hands over my own. Probably. That's why everything is healing faster. Yes. I worried my lip, trying to keep the tremble out of my voice. Will I die? Probably not. How much time? We're not going to think about that right now, okay? Samuel reached to brush away my hair but kept his hand on my cheek. His voice grew deeper as he smoothed his thumb against my skin. This never should have happened. I never wanted you to change. Not if you didn't want to. I know I said some things at the beginning of all this, but I was acting out of anger and I didn't know what else to do. I know that's not an excuse. I know this is insanely messed up. Samuel broke off and forced out a long sigh. His jaw was stiff and he refused to look anywhere but at the wall. After a moment he closed his eyes and said, "Now the choice was taken away from you completely." I nodded and watched as Samuel crumpled before me. His head was lowered so I couldn't see his face, but that enough spoke volumes. Samuel was always able to put on a mask when he needed to. At least he was able to until now. He took in a ragged breath. I just wish I was there to stop it. I reached for Samuel's cheek, but he kept his gaze hidden. After a moment I sighed and looked around, trying to form what I wanted to say. I wish I started rubbing my arm. I wish you were there too. I realize that now. I never wanted to leave, not at the end anyway. I've spent so much time running and all it's done is hurt everyone. I'm not going to say that everything is okay because it's not. But for the moment we're both alive and getting better. Let's just face everything else when it comes, alright? When Samuel didn't respond, I grabbed his hand and tried to pull him back to the present. Thank you, I told him. For staying, for saving me, for fighting Bray, for helping everyone. Samuel slowly looked up at me. Always Samantha. Remember that. I gave him a small smile. I'm going to need you now. There's no use in fighting it anymore. He mimicked my expression and kissed my hand. As long as you're there with me. Chapter 65 Chiefs. It was almost evening. Samuel and I spent the day together, mostly in silence. Unfortunately, the Chiefs were growing impatient. They came to the hospital and there was no more avoiding anything. Samuel stood next to me, holding my hand as they entered. The door shut behind them with an ominous thud and the air in the room thickened. The two of them, a man and a woman, stood rod straight, staring at Samuel and me. The woman was taller than the man by several inches. Her skin was as pale as the hospital light and her eyes were tired. She had long black hair pulled into a high ponytail that swished as she walked further into the room. The man stood short but was built like an athlete. He had tan skin and dark hair that was growing thin. His eyes were cold and sunken, but when he spoke, his words were warm. "Delighted to meet you, Samantha," he said with a drawn-out accent. "My name is Thern and this is Kay." Thern turned to Samuel. "Good to see you on your feet, Beta." Samuel nodded his head to both of them. "Chief Knox." "Chief Spears." The woman Kay spoke next. "We need to ask you several questions before we can proceed." I took a breath. "I understand." She turned to Samuel. "I hope you understand our need to speak without you here." Samuel stiffened, then nodded. "Of course." He bowed his head to each of them again, then turned to me. "I'll be right outside." He gave my hand a squeeze and left the room. As soon as he was gone, I felt my chest tighten. Kay and Thern stared at me with looks I couldn't quite decipher. I tried not to picture them as the all-powerful werewolves they actually were. I tried to ignore the fact they could kill me in less than a second. I tried not to think about what would happen if I told them something they didn't want to hear. Thern was the first to break the silence. "Beta, Samuel has told us a lot about you." "It is not often a human has a mate," Kay interjected. My fingers twisted together and I took a deep breath. "Yes, that is true. Do you believe yourself to be his mate?" Kay tilted her head and the light inside the room seemed to draw the rest of the color from her face. I furrowed my brow as my stomach twisted. Humans can't have mates. "We realize this," Thern spoke, taking one small step forward. "But what do you believe?" I paused for a moment. "I don't know. I trust Samuel." Kay nodded and Thern smiled. A diplomatic answer, he said, rubbing a rough hand along his arms. It's the truth, I told them. Kay looked around the room. Have you always trusted him? Well, no, I said. Trust is earned. Therne laughed abruptly, rocking back on his heels. Perfect answers. Kay narrowed her eyes and looked down at the man. She spoke to me, but her gaze remained on Therne. Tell us of what happened. I took a deep breath. Starting when? When you first met the beta, broke in Therne. I struggled at first. So much had happened in so little time, and I hadn't wanted to leave anything out. I didn't want them thinking I was hiding anything, or that Samuel had some long and secret plot I was involved in. He deserved to be alpha. It didn't matter if he was once human. He was better than any wolf I'd met before. Kay and Therne held on to every word I said. They each interjected into my story with certain questions and clarifications, but for the most part, they listened. The longer I spoke, the more Kay narrowed her eyes. Therne forgot his previous smile and looked at me with a lifeless expression. I could tell nothing about what either of them was thinking or if I was digging Samuel and me a deeper hole. When I finished my life story since meeting Samuel, Therne moved to the window and stared outside. Kay remained in her spot in the middle of the room. Despite their distance, they bounced questions off each other and directed them at me faster than I could think. What happened to the girl you left with? Therne asked. I don't know. I thought she was killed, like I said. Kay didn't hesitate with her question. How did you survive? I don't know. After the fight, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in the hospital with Samuel. It seems awful lucky that you got away, Therne said, almost to himself. Kay nodded and glanced at him. Humans don't survive that. I glanced back and forth between them, exasperated with their constant questions, tired of being awake and in their presence, and wishing for nothing but Samuel to be by my side again. Anger and annoyance pricked my heart and I responded before I could stop myself. I lost a leg and I was bitten by a werewolf. I wouldn't call that lucky. The duo was silent as I bit my tongue and cursed my outburst. Apparently, I'd still learned nothing in that department. Just at the moment when I thought Therne and Kay were going to erupt, Therne laughed and Kay rolled her eyes. Therne turned from the window and walked over to the foot of my bed. That was long overdue, he smiled. You do well under stress. I think we have adequate information, Kay announced. Therne nodded to me, then made his way to Kay. The two headed for the door without glancing back. Sudden anxiety clenched my heart, and just as they were about to open the door, I asked what's going to happen. Therne turned and smiled, and it seemed genuine. We need to discuss things first. We will alert Samuel when we have reached a decision. Thank you for your time. Kay nodded toward me, then grabbed Therne by the arm. Before I could say another word, they both turned and left. They were gone faster than they arrived, and I was left more worried than before. Not a moment later, though, Samuel was rushing back into the room. He smiled when he saw me, then shut the door and sat at the foot of my bed. I raised my hands helplessly. I tried. I told them the truth about everything that happened. I don't know, Samuel. They asked a lot of questions and I couldn't tell what they were thinking, and hush, he said. You did great. I heard the whole thing. I don't know. I shook my head and groaned. Samuel rubbed his hand up and down my leg and looked around the room. The worst they can do is send me away and appoint someone else. Actually, the worst they could do is kill all of us. He laughed once. Somehow, I don't think that is going to happen. But what if they do send you away? Then Samuel stood and walked to the head of my bed before cupping my cheeks and glancing between both of my eyes. Will be so heartbroken that I will definitely need an extraordinary amount of kissing and ego boosts to ever be okay again. He was fighting back a smile. My expression fell and I stared at him without a hint of amusement. Underneath it all, though, I might have cracked a grin. I'm serious, Samuel, I deadpanned. Samuel laughed and retreated back to his chair beside me. So am I. But, on top of that, I might also consider leaving and taking a few people with me if they'd want to come, of course. I do still have a family I would like to one day see again. His voice softened at the end of his sentence and all tones of amusement were washed away. If you want company, I know a few people who might come along. Samuel smiled wider than I'd seen him smile in a long time. I reached for his hands, and the expression only grew. Whatever happens, I began, we'll be all right. We've made it this far. Who knows? You could still be alpha. Maybe this world isn't so bad after all. Samuel groaned. It was barely there, but I heard the noise and everything that went along with it. I gave Samuel a questioning look, but he shrugged and glanced away. Let's just see what they have to say, he said. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Epilogue. The beach wasn't as peaceful to walk down anymore, but Samuel and I did it hand in hand. I used him as a crutch and he lifted me over rocks and rushing water. Our pace was slow and we had no specific destination in mind, only the fresh air and sounds of folding waves. Samuel's phone rang. He dropped my hand to hold it up to his good ear, and we both stopped walking. After a moment he paused the call, took my hand, and carried me away from the water to sit on a set of rocks overlooking the sea. As soon as we sat down, I undid my prosthetic and rubbed the tender skin. I was aching almost everywhere. The doctors told me exercise was good, but with the amount of physical therapy they were putting me through, I was ready to topple over at any given minute. Samuel sat next to me and spoke into the phone in a low voice. "Goldie, what's wrong?" Her voice hummed on the other end of the line in a rapid succession of words. Samuel pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head. "No, I really don't care that Marshall won't stop calling you Alpha." I laughed silently as Samuel sighed, with no other option than to listen to Goldie's rants. "He's your father. He can do whatever he likes." He paused. "No, that's not my job." Samuel took my hand as he waited for Goldie to finish speaking. She tended to be quite long-winded lately. In all honesty, she still hated the alpha position. But the chiefs had given it to her. It was either that or let the pack be run by someone on the outside. They told us they believed and trusted Samuel. But in the fragile state the pack was in, they wanted a full-blooded wolf to take the alpha position. I was furious. It went against everything I knew to be right and everything Samuel had ever told me. Samuel was more capable than anyone to watch over his pack. He deserved it. But what surprised me most out of anything was that Samuel wasn't upset about it. He never wanted any of it anyway. Not in the way it was being given to him. I fully understood this when we were sitting in his apartment as he packed his things and tried to replace his door. Goldie wanted him back in the pack house, and with Will taking on other positions in the pack and my shift coming soon, we decided it wasn't a bad idea. Samuel was kneeling next to the door, picking up pieces of splintered wood. I just delivered a long-winded rant about the tyranny of wolves and the problems of hierarchy. He listened to everything I told him, then wiped his hands and turned to face me. "The world isn't fair, Samantha. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we can influence it." I had thought a lot about his words, especially as of late. I wasn't too keen on the idea of becoming a wolf. It would happen during the next full moon and I felt ill-prepared. Not only because I could potentially die, but also because I still hated certain things about the wolves. Those would take time and effort to work through. It helped that I talked with Samuel more, but these weren't things that were going to change simply because I was forced to become the thing I hated. But, in the end, I realized it wasn't specifically the wolves. There was corruption and selfishness and manipulation everywhere. If I looked enough, every aspect of life would be filled with it. So, I tried to do as Samuel suggested and understand the world so I could at least try and influence it. If there was anything I knew, it was that I didn't want anyone else going through what my family went through. Things could be better. So instead of dwelling on the hellishness of reality, I poured my efforts into the cracks of light that tried to fill the darkness. Samuel was helping. He showed me a lot about his world. In turn, I showed him more of the human side of things. We talked with Goldie, and though a lot of the pack still regarded me as scum, some were changing their hearts. The pack was changing, mostly because much of Goldie's alpha responsibilities were now dispersed throughout the pack. She ran things a lot differently than Riley had, and only a few people complained. In the end, Samuel got most of the work, but he didn't mind. It was only moments like these, when Goldie forced him to stay on the phone with her, that he wished he could run away. No, I didn't know that. Samuel paused again and shot me a glance. How rude of Will. I covered my mouth and tried not to laugh out loud. Samuel was supposed to be working now, and if Goldie knew he was with me, then neither of us would hear the end of it. I'll have Samantha try to reel him in. He listened for a few more moments, then smiled. Yes, she can. Is there anything else? Then finally he sighed and said, "I'll see you tonight." Samuel hung up the phone and leaned back, shutting his eyes and groaning. "I can't handle her, Samantha." I released my long-suppressed laugh. "You're doing just fine." "No, really, I think I might quit." You can't quit. I can pretend I can. Come on, you big baby. I laughed again and pushed off Samuel to stand. I placed my weight on both my feet, and as soon as that happened, I went plummeting to the ground. Samuel caught me before I was buried in a mound of sand. I laughed and tucked my hair behind my ears as he stood me upright, then picked my prosthetic off the ground. Missing something. He smirked. A leg, I guess. Samuel groaned. You and Marshall are going to kill me. I sat back down and allowed Samuel to refasten my missing limb. You'd have to hear us coming first. Haha, he said. I can hear just fine. Your phone's ringing again. Samuel jumped and picked his phone up, only to see a blank screen. He looked at me with tired eyes and I almost apologized. Then one corner of his mouth turned up and he threw my prosthetic into the sand. Without warning, he lifted me on his shoulders and carried me straight into the ocean. I was laughing and kicking his back, screaming when the cold water reached my toes. When we were deep enough, Samuel dropped me in the water without a second thought. As I surfaced, cursing him loudly, he was bent over laughing. My teeth were chattering as I searched my body for warmth. You better hope I don't get sick, wolf boy. Samuel splashed more water on me, before picking me up and holding me close. He held me up so that our faces were only inches apart. Then, as he had done 100 times before, Samuel kissed me like there was nothing else in this world that could make him happy. Wouldn't dream of it, Sammy girl. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.